Many people today have grown up believing that the Israelites left Egypt and traveled north into the Levant, where the modern state of Israel is located. But when we strip away thousands of years of reinterpretation, remove the geographical assumptions added by later scholars, and return to the raw words of the Bible and ancient books like Jasher and Jubilees, a very different picture emerges. The scriptures themselves, when taken literally and logically, reveal that the original Promised Land was not in the Levant at all. It was in Africa. And not only was it in Africa, but its exact locations, its rivers, its mountains, its kingdoms, its neighboring nations, its battles, and its entire story unfolded in the Nile/Kush region of Africa, stretching from Egypt deep into Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and beyond. So if this is the case, then how did translators change an African story into a Middle Eastern Levantine story? It was by using a method called layering. Layering is a well-known strategy by money launderers. Layering is when criminals hide the true source of money by passing it through many steps, so no one can trace it back to where it began. The same idea can happen with history and stories, when later writers add new layers to original stories to cover up the real location where something happened. The main argument is that Bible translators and later editors used this type of layering to hide the original African setting of many stories, especially those that took place in Eastern Africa. When we study this properly, we must use only deductive analysis of the Bible's own geography and ignore Western scholars and archaeological claims, because if any group is doing the relocation, we cannot use any other information from that same group to investigate them. Western powers also duplicated many African place names in the Levant, so no one would notice that the true Promised Land was originally in Africa. One story in the Bible where you can catch Bible translators using this layering strategy is Daniel chapters 2 and 3. Daniel chapter 2 shows a local African setting where Daniel rises quickly to power and becomes ruler over the whole province of Babylon. In Daniel 2 verse 48, it says, "And his friends were placed over the work of the province." This makes sense only in a small nearby region such as ancient African groups, not in a faraway powerful Asian empire. When the story is initially told in Daniel chapter 2, there is no long distance travel, no language barrier, and messages move instantly. But Daniel chapter 3 suddenly introduces Persian terms like governors and satraps, which did not even exist in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. This shows that later editors added Persian elements to an older African story. This is the same layering method used to hide the original geography of other biblical places. The original biblical nation of Ashur in Africa was fraudulently changed to Assyria in West Africa. Babel in Africa was fraudulently changed to Babylon in Asia. The river Perith in Africa was fraudulently changed to Euphrates in Asia. The river Hiddekel in Africa was fraudulently changed to the Tigris River in Iraq. Aram in Africa was changed to Syria, and Sennaar in Africa was fraudulently changed to Shinar in Iraq. These changes were made so the African origins would be forgotten. But the internal logic and geography of the Bible shows that the true settings of the stories were in Africa, before later writers layered foreign names on top. This presentation will walk you through the overwhelming textual, linguistic, geographical, archaeological, historical, and traditional evidence showing how the Promised Land was originally African, and how it was later stolen and relocated into the Middle East by interpreters who imposed foreign geography onto the Bible. Once you hear the full explanation, the African origin of the Bible becomes undeniable. We begin with a detail in the book of Jubilees that can be easily overlooked. The biblical patriarch named Peleg. Peleg was born in the land of Kush to Eber and Azareth, the daughter of Nimrod who married Eber. This means early life of Peleg took place inside Africa. When Peleg later married Lamna, the daughter of Sinuar, Jubilees shows that Sinuar was also living in the same East African region of Kush. This is the only place where Sinuar appears as a man, and it proves that the families were close together in the Kush area in modern-day Sudan, where there is a region called Sennaar. Genesis 10 shows Nimrod was a son of Kush, and Genesis 10 verse 10 YLT says the first part of his kingdom is Babel, in the land of Shinar, which matches the Jubilees name Sinuar. Since Nimrod ruled in the Kush area, it makes sense that Shinar was also nearby in Africa. Jubilees 10 describes a sea in the land of Shinar that produced bitumen, which fits the Nile regions of Sudan, and not Mesopotamia. Jubilees also says the tower stood between Ashur and Babylon in the land of Shinar, and old maps place an ancient Babylon south of Egypt. Jubilees 9:3 shows that Ashur's inheritance was also in Africa, likely north of the Gin River, still within the African land division of Shem. If Ashur's land was in Africa and bordered Shinar, then Shinar must also be in Africa. The borders make sense only inside the Nile regions, because Ashur's land in early times was tightly connected to Egypt, Kush, and the highlands. All these clues show that Peleg, Azrid, Nimrod, Sinoar, and Ashur were living in one African environment, and that the marriages, births, cities, and the tower story all happened inside the Kush region. This supports the argument that the true Shinar is the same as Sennaar in Sudan, and that the early Bible stories took place within Africa. Next, let's consider the story of the biblical personality, known as Job. When we study the story of Job very slowly and carefully, we see that the Chaldeans who attacked him in Job 1 were not from Iraq, and were not an empire. Job 1 verse 17 says the Chaldeans came in 3 small bands and made a quick raid. This shows they were a simple tribal group who lived close to Job. When we go to Genesis 22 verses 20 to 22, we see the name Chesed, also written as Kased, as one of the sons of Nahor, the brother of Abraham. This means the original Chaldeans were the children of Kased, and Kased was from the family line of Shem. So the Chaldeans in the story of Job were early Shemite people who lived in East Africa, not later Babylonians. The Bible has a clear rule that when it introduces a people group for the first time in earlier chapters, it never switches to a new group with the same name. For example, the Canaanites stay the children of Canaan from Genesis to Kings, and the Philistines stay the children of Casluim from Genesis to Samuel. In the same way, the Chaldeans in Job must be the same family of Kased from Genesis 22, and not a new empire or group far away in Iraq, because Job lived in the land of Uz, which comes from the sons of Aram in Genesis 10, and because Uz is connected to the early Shemite lands, and because both the Sabaeans from Kush and the Chaldeans from Kased attacked Job in one region. It means all these people lived close together. This fits better with an African setting, especially in the Sudan area where Shemite and Kushite groups lived side by side. So the original Chaldeans were African Shemites from the family of Kased, and the later name used in Babylonian Iraq was a copy or a relocation of the older African name. The next point, closely related to the previous point, is the fact that the Chaldea mentioned in the Bible was connected to ancient Israel by sea. There are several passages that show movement between the original Israelite homeland and the original Babylon by sea. These verses only make sense if both places were on the same coastline, or connected by a continuous water route as we see along the Red Sea region of Africa. This strongly supports the argument that the true ancient Israel and the true Babylon were both in Africa, along connected waterways and seas, rather than separated by a huge desert as in the Middle East maps. In Isaiah 23, Tyre, Tarshish, and the land of the Chaldeans. Isaiah says ships of Tarshish and merchants of Tyre interacted directly with the land of the Chaldeans. This only works if the Chaldeans were reachable by sea, which fits an African coastal or river delta Babylon along the Red Sea route, not an inland Iraq Babylon. Also in Ezekiel 27, sea trade with Chaldeans. Ezekiel lists many seafaring nations trading with Tyre. The list includes regions tied to Chaldeans and Aram. This means the Chaldean region was part of a water trade network. Iraq has no such network, but Africa's Red Sea region, Nile River system, and east-west coastal routes matches this perfectly. Next, let's try to understand biblical geography from the perspective of the ancient Egyptians. When God told Moses in Exodus 3 verse 8 that he would bring the Israelites up, out of Egypt to a good land, flowing with milk and honey, it is important to understand the terms using the ancient Egyptian view of directions and geography. Egyptians saw the entrance to their land as coming from the south, because the Nile River flows from the south to the north. So leaving Egypt would mean going south, which was both the entry and exit direction for Egypt. This matches the ancient way of saying, up, meaning toward higher elevation. The land south of Egypt, around Kush, modern Sudan and Ethiopia, is higher in elevation than Egypt and is fertile, with large rivers like the Nile and the Blue Nile flowing there. It fits the description of a good, spacious land flowing with milk and honey, meaning it is full of life, animals, plants, and natural riches. The Levant, east or northeast of Egypt, though fertile in some areas, lies lower, and Egyptians did not traditionally see it as the entrance to their land. So when in the Bible God says, "I will bring my people up, out of Egypt, into a good land," the best fit is going south toward Kush, not north to the Levant. This view also matches other scriptures where Canaan and Kush are described as neighbors, and the river Gin, which surrounds the land of Kush, points to that area, not the Levant. Understanding the directions this way helps us see that God's promise to bring his people out of Egypt to a good land fits best with the land south of Egypt, near Kush, and not far away in the Levant, respecting how ancient people understood the world geographically. This approach makes Bible descriptions clearer and fits ancient historical and geographical evidence. Next, let's analyze some evidence from archaeology. The ancient Egyptian New Kingdom topographical lists, especially from the temples of Thutmose III at Karnak and Amenhotep III at Salab. These lists name conquered cities, often grouped by region. Occasionally, a heading groups cities from Canaan under the term the South, RSY. Based solely on the documented scholarly interpretation of the Salab list and related toponym lists by Egyptologists Raphael Givian and Shmuel Ahatov, the cities grouped under the heading or subheading meaning, the southern region, RSY, within the land of Huru include Gezer, Ashkelon, and Lachish. This list under the heading Southlands exposes fraudulent interpretation of biblical scholars who located the land of Canaan in the northeast, even though the ancient Egyptians clearly say Canaan cities, Gezer, Ashkelon, and Lachish, were located in the south of Egypt. Any modern locations in modern Israel with the names Gezer, Ashkelon, and Lachish are therefore a duplication of the original sites that were located south of Egypt. In summary, the Egyptian topographical lists from the New Kingdom, such as those of Thutmose III at Karnak and Amenhotep III at Salab, give very strong clues that the original land of Canaan was located south of Egypt in Africa, not in the northeast where modern scholars place it. In these lists, Egyptian scribes grouped certain Canaanite cities under the term RSY, which means the south. Egyptologists like Raphael Givian and Shmuel Ahatov confirmed that the Salab list groups biblical cities such as Gezer, Ashkelon, and Lachish under this heading, meaning the Egyptians themselves believed these biblical cities were in the southern region. Since Egypt's south leads into Nubia and deeper into Africa, this means that the true original locations of these biblical cities were in Africa, not in Asia. The modern places with the same names in today's Israel must therefore be later copies or replacements created after the original African geography was forgotten or deliberately changed. This also matches the biblical pattern that early movements of Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, the Philistines, and the Canaanites all take place inside the African regions located south of Egypt like Kush, Mizraim, and the Nile corridor. It also fits with the Book of Jubilees and Genesis, where the borders of the early nations run through African lands and African rivers such as the Gihorn. The Egyptians had no reason to lie about the direction, and their own maps placed these Canaan cities in the south of Egypt. This shows that the real land of Canaan was south of Egypt, inside Africa, and that the current locations in the Middle East are later copies created to support a false geography. Next, let's consider the true meaning of the names of some prominent biblical personalities. Many people do not know that the name Phinehas, which appears many times in the Bible, comes from the Old Egyptian word Panehasi, which means the Nubian or the dark-skinned one. This shows that the Israelites used names that pointed to African identity. The most famous Phinehas was the grandson of Aaron. In Numbers 25, he stopped the anger of God when the Israelites joined with the Moabite women. God said in Numbers 25:11 that Phinehas turned away his wrath and saved Israel. If his name really meant the dark-skinned one, then this means the priestly family of Israel carried a name that pointed to a black or Nubian identity, and they saw nothing wrong with that. There were other Israelites with the same name too. In 1 Samuel chapters 1-4, another man named Phinehas was the son of Eli the high priest. Later, in Ezra 8 verse 33, the name appears again in the priestly line. This shows the name was common and respected, and it was used for leaders. If the Israelites were not connected to Africa, They would not choose a name that directly means the Nubian or dark-skinned one. And they would not use it for their high priests and their families. The later idea that the name means mouth of a serpent comes from people trying to hide the African meaning. They took two Hebrew words and forced them together, even though the Bible never explains the name this way. The strong African meaning was pushed aside, and the snake idea became the new explanation so that readers would not link Israel to Africa. The fact that so many leaders carried a name meaning dark-skinned one is strong evidence that Israel had African roots and identity. In the book of Jasher chapter 25, Abraham takes Keturah as a wife from the land of Canaan, and his children later move eastward. Their movement is overland, with no mention of crossing seas, rivers, or deserts. This matters because Kush, where the children settled east of, was in Africa, specifically Sudan and northern Ethiopia. So the entire journey stays on African soil. This means Abraham was somewhere near Western Africa at that time. Genesis 25 confirms this by saying Abraham sent his sons eastward, but never implies a continental shift. If Abraham was in the Middle East, moving eastward would carry his sons further into Asia, but the apocryphal text clearly shows movement within Africa. This is the first crack in the traditional view. As we continue through the texts, we see a deliberate pattern of relocation by later scholars trying to fit the biblical narrative into the Middle East. Names like Babel, Ashur, Shinar, Perith, and Hittite were shamelessly transferred from Africa to the Middle East simply because similar-sounding words existed there. Genesis never says the Hittite River is the Tigris, or that the Perith River is the Euphrates. Scholars made those assumptions. The Gihon River is said to circle Kush, which is African, so if the Gihon River is African, and all four rivers share one source, then the Pishon, Hittite, and Perith must also be African. Early maps from the 1500s even show Sennar on maps of Africa, which aligns with the biblical Shinar, located in Sudan. Many people do not know that the Septuagint uses the spelling Sennar for the land called Shinar in Genesis, and this spelling matches the name Sennar in the region south of Egypt in Sudan. This is important because Genesis 10 links Shinar with the children of Kush through Nimrod, and Kush is always an African area. This Sennar is a real historical city in Sudan, known from the Funj kingdom along the Blue Nile. Genesis 2 verse 13 says the Gin flows around the land of Kush, and this fits the Ethiopia and Sudan region, not Asia. When people move toward Shinar in Genesis 11 verse 2, the direction agrees with the Nile pattern seen in Egypt and Kush. When Western writers connect African Sennar with an Asian Shinar, they remove the African meaning and move the story away from the original setting. The match of the name Sennar, the Kushite family line, and the Nile geography makes strong support that the true Shinar was in Africa, and that later maps fraudulently shifted this heritage into the Middle East. Western tradition did this because it did not fit their new narrative. The Bible's earliest geography places all these nations beside Egypt and Kush, not in Iraq or Syria. In Eritrea, the ancient port of Adulis preserves an oral tradition that its founders were escapees from Egyptian oppression. The name Adulis means free people, reflecting liberation from Egyptian overlords. Ancient Egyptian expeditions to Punt further confirm how connected Egypt was to the Horn of Africa. These traditions preserve an African-centered biblical world where movements between Egypt, Kush, and the surrounding regions were frequent, natural, and geographically coherent. The very term Hebrew appears artificially inserted. The first time we hear Abram the Hebrew is when one of his own servants identifies him this way, which makes no sense, because this is Abraham's own servant who has lived with him for years. So it does not make sense that he called Abraham by the name Abraham the Hebrew. Abraham's true heritage was Aramean, and Deuteronomy 26 verse 5 says clearly, "An Aramean ready to perish was my father." So the earliest Aram was African. Modern traditions relocated Aram to Syria, breaking the African connection. Jesus spoke Aramaic, never Hebrew, and the early prophets were from African Aramaic cultures. The word Hebrew, therefore, appears to be a later label introduced to sever Abraham's lineage from African identity. If the scribes kept the African Aramaic identity intact, the reality would be obvious. Abraham was African, Jacob was African, and the entire covenant unfolded in Africa. Next, let's examine the African language meaning of the name Isaac. African languages preserve the original meaning of Isaac far more accurately than Hebrew. The Bible says the name Isaac means he laughs. In Swahili, Chika means laugh. In Zulu and Xhosa, Klika means laugh. In Shona, Sika means laugh. The African name Isaka still exists today. In contrast, modern Hebrew uses Tsachak, which no longer resembles the name Isaac at all. How come African languages are the ones that preserve the original meaning, despite Western traditional scholars claim that the biblical story took place far away? Because the original memory lives where the story unfolded, in Africa. In a similar way, some African traditions also preserve Jacob's identity. In Yoruba, Jacob appears as a Kobi, which means firstborn. This suggests that in the older African memory, Jacob was understood as the rightful firstborn rather than the trickster portrayed in the edited biblical story. The contradictions in Genesis 25 and 27, prophecy choosing Jacob before birth, yet later stories depicting deception, suggest later narrative reshaping. The African tradition preserves the older truth. Now let's examine some biblical place names, and you will see that even ancient biblical cities like Zor and Sodom were originally African. Jasher 46:16 lists Zor among Egyptian regions, proving it was not in the Levant. The volcanic destruction described in Genesis matches the Danakil Depression of Ethiopia, a region filled with fire, sulfur, and volcanic activity, unlike the Dead Sea area which lacks such active volcanism. This makes the African setting far more accurate than the Levantine imitation. Numbers 33:40 reveals that the king of Arad dwelt, in the south, in the land of Canaan. Modern maps place Canaan north of Egypt, but the Bible places it south of Egypt. This means the entire concept of Canaan was hijacked and relocated. Genesis 10's borders, Joshua's campaigns, and Abraham's travels all confirm that the original Canaan lay to the south of Egypt, not northeast of Egypt. When we reconstruct the Israelite route using actual travel distances, the journey leads directly into Sudan, not Israel. 3 days south of Egypt places them near northern Sudan. Avoiding Edom would take them deeper into Sudan. The Jordan in this context refers to the Nile's tributaries, the Blue Nile or White Nile. Lot chooses the fertile eastern plains, while Abraham settles west of the Nile. This geographic setting aligns perfectly with the story, unlike the Levant. Joshua 11 verse 16 speaks of the land of Goshen as part of the conquest. The only Goshen in Genesis is the southern province of Egypt, not in the Levant. The Bible never mentions a northern Goshen. This confirms Joshua's conquests unfolded in Africa. One of the strongest proofs that the biblical lands were African comes from Jasher 55:31. Joseph hides treasure near the Red Sea, near the river Frat, and near the wildernesses of Persia and Media. But since the Israelites later take these treasures during the Exodus, these locations had to be near Egypt, not thousands of miles away in Mesopotamia. This means Perith, Persia, and Media originally referred to African regions south of Egypt. Joseph could not have traveled to Iraq, hidden treasure, and expected the Israelites to retrieve it quickly as they fled Egypt. This is unarguable internal logic. Next comes one of the most blatant manipulations committed by traditional biblical translators, replacing the word south with Negev. Early translations say Abraham traveled toward the south. Later versions replace this with toward the Negev, a Levantine location. But Genesis 12 show Abraham moving from the west to Shechem, then east, then south, then down into Egypt. When he was returning to Canaan, Genesis 13 verse 1 says Abraham and his family went up in elevation toward south of Egypt, not northeast. This movement only matches African geography. If Abraham had come from Iraq, the directions would be entirely different. The original text makes sense only in Africa. Ancient Egyptian cardinal directions confirm that Egypt labeled its own southern lands RSY and its northern lands MW. They never used these terms for places in Asia or the Levant. Canaan appears as RSY in several enemy lists, placing Canaan south of Egypt, not north. Biblical Goshen is also upriver, because when the family of Joseph arrived in Egypt, Joseph had to mount a chariot to go meet his family, and the Bible says he went upriver to meet them. This places the story 100% in an African setting. The Book of Jubilees says the Red Sea formed Israel's eastern border. This is impossible in the Levant, but makes perfect sense in East Africa, where the Red Sea lies to the east of the Nile corridor. At Kadesh Barnea, Moses tells the spies to go up this way southward. But modern maps place Kadesh south of Canaan, making southward travel impossible. If the Promised Land were in the Levant, the Bible's directions contradict modern maps because the Bible originally described African geography. The biblical giants, the Anakim, Rephaim, and Emim, match the tall Nilotic peoples of South Sudan far better than any Levantine group. The Levant has no indigenous giant tribes, but Africa does. Jasher 72 reveals that the people of Kush feared that Canaan might invade if their army was delayed. This fear is logical only if Canaan were right next to Kush. Therefore, Canaan was not in Palestine, it was beside Sudan and Ethiopia, and extended further south into the Bantu-speaking areas of Africa. Aram is placed west of Kush in Jasher 72. Since Kush is in Sudan, Aram was originally an African land west of Sudan, towards West Africa, not Syria. Ezekiel 38 lists Kush and put among northern invaders, which only makes sense if Israel was south of them. This places biblical Israel deep in Africa. The original Canaan spanned the area from eastern Africa, all the way to Sub-Saharan Africa. The Tower of the Watchers, mentioned in 2 Kings 17 is Migdol, an Egyptian watchtower. This tower was in Africa. The Israelites camped between Migdol and the sea, meaning they were still in Africa. They never crossed into Asia. The Israelites required vast water supplies while in the desert, heading towards the Promised Land. The Sinai Desert could not sustain millions of people. The Nile and Gihon River corridor in Africa could. Moses grinding the golden calf and making the people drink water comes from a region where water was abundant. This only fits Africa. Jubilees says Shem's descendants received the south, meaning Africa. Later scholars reversed the assignment and relocated Shem from Africa to Asia. But the original text clearly gives Africa to Shem. The wildlife of the Bible, lions, hippos, crocodiles, ostriches, exists naturally only in Africa. These animals never existed in biblical Israel in the quantities described. The biblical fauna matches African ecosystems, not Asia or Middle East. Africa's huge mountains match biblical descriptions of exceeding high mountains. The small hills of the Middle East and Levant do not. Africa's terrain fits the Bible better. Ancient maps from 1525 to 1600 place Babylon, written as Balbaim or Babylon, south of Egypt in Africa, and it also places Babel in the center region of the Sudan. Cairo in modern-day Egypt was even called Babylon. Jasher describes people moving from Shinar or Sennar in Sudan into Egypt with ease, showing proximity. Babylon originally lay in Africa. The Temian people of Sudan preserved the name Taman, son of Esau. This means Edom was in Sudan, not Jordan. Egyptian inscriptions place the Shesu of YHW in Sudan. This is not speculation. It is carved in stone. The earliest worship of Yahweh is recorded in Nubia. The 10 tribes of Israel were scattered beyond the rivers of Kush, according to Zephaniah 3 verse 10. Their later regathering will be to that same region. So the African location is preserved in prophecy. Sennar in Sudan was renamed Shinar to fit a Mesopotamian geography and steal the Promised Land out of Africa. Jubilees 8 and 9 prove Sennar was African, not Asian. Isaiah 49 verse 12 in literal translations mentions Aswan, not China. This places the end-time return of God's chosen people from South and West Africa. Jacob remains the true name for the chosen people, not Israel. Prophecies repeatedly use Jacob, not Israel, showing Israel is a later overlay. The 4 rivers of Eden all connect to Africa. If the Gyan River is the Nile or Blue Nile River in Africa, then all the other rivers from Eden must also be African. The Bible says the Pishon River flowed through Havilah. Remember, Havilah, son of Kush, lived inside Kush's territory in Africa, meaning the Pishon River also flowed through Africa. Great stone-walled African cities match biblical descriptions of ancient fortifications better than anything found in Palestine. Great Zimbabwe, Harar, and Thimlik-Ohinga display the same traditions of construction. Abraham's palm branch rituals require low, accessible palms like the dum palm of Egypt and Sudan, not the extremely tall date palms of the Levant. The Frat River mentioned in Kings and Jasher is African, not Mesopotamian, because Joseph hid treasures by this river for the Israelites to later retrieve when he was in Egypt. Joseph placed treasures near this river, with the intention that the Israelites will take these treasures with them to go build a temple for God when they leave Egypt one day, proving it was close to Egypt. The Battle of Carchemish that historians claim took place by the Euphrates River was an African conflict between Egypt and Ashur near an African Frat River, not the Euphrates of Iraq. The Canaanites mentioned in the Amarna letters lived near Sudan and southern Egypt. Egyptian inscriptions of lands with conflicts grouped the Canaanites among the southern lands, located south of Egypt. This matches Jasher 72 accounts of the Kushites building walls out of fear of the Canaanites who were their neighbors. So that Canaan was besides Kush. Sudanese Beja traditions claim Solomon imprisoned Jinn in Suakin. Suakin, on Sudan's Red Sea coast, was once a major African port known for trade, pilgrimage, and unique coral stone architecture. It linked Africa with Arabia, India, and the wider Indian Ocean, handling goods like ivory and gold. Suakin declined after Port Sudan was built, but remains an important historic site. This reflects real memory of Israelite presence in Africa. Such a tradition would not exist if Israel were far away in Palestine. Solomon's fleet at Ezion-Geber was built on the Red Sea in African Edom, not in Jordan. This shows that Solomon's kingdom was located in Africa, further south of modern-day Sudan. The biblical nations of Edom and Seir appear in the Salab temple inscriptions in Sudan, confirming Edom's African location. Once you located Edom in Africa, the Promised Land must logically be in African also, because on their way to the Promised Land from Egypt, the Israelites asked permission from the Edomites to go south through Edomite territory. Joel 3 describes Israelites being sold to Greeks. The displacement of the original Promised Land from Sub-Saharan Africa to the Middle Eastern and Mediterranean world was the result of this Greek intrusion into Africa's biblical land, mentioned in Joel chapter 3. The oldest scrolls likely originated in Africa and were exported outward. Jubilees places Shem's land, containing Zion, Sinai, Eden, and Ophir in Africa. All boundary markers describe the African continent. Later, and when translators wrote the book of Genesis, they removed the African markers found in the book of Jubilees, leaving only genealogies. This removal made it easier to transplant biblical geography into Asia. If these borders had not been erased, the Promised Land would stretch from Ethiopia's highlands to the Atlantic coast, and southward into Central Africa. Finally, when Moses requested passage through Edom, the Israelites were coming from Egypt in the north and traveling south. Edom was located to the south of Egypt, and the Promised Land lay even farther south, deeper into Sub-Saharan Africa. Scholars falsely claim that the Canaanites lived in the Levant, but this idea creates a clear problem. The Bible says the Canaanites came from Ham, so they are Hamites. If Hamites lived in the Levant, then Asia must have Hamites. But scholars today say there are no Hamites in Asia. To explain this missing group, they say the Canaanites died out. But the Bible does not agree with that. Joshua 16 verse 10 says the Canaanites stayed there unto this day. Judges 1 verse 27 to 133 also says many Canaanite groups continued to live in the land for many years. This means the Canaanites were not destroyed, and they had children who also lived there. So Hamites were still present. This also means the Levant was not only the land of Shem, because Ham's children were there too. Scholars do not want to accept this point, because if they do, they must admit the old map of Israel and Canaan should move back toward Africa, which is where the land of Ham was given in the beginning. If the Canaanites were actually in Africa, then everything fits well, because Ham stayed in Africa, Shem stayed in Africa, and Japheth moved into Eurasia. But when scholars place the Canaanites in the Levant, they must explain why Hamites suddenly vanished, even though the Bible clearly says they did not disappear. This forms a continuous African narrative with no breaks, no sea crossings, and no Middle Eastern locations. When all the evidence is placed together, scriptural, linguistic, historical, archaeological, traditional, geographical, and cultural, the conclusion is unmistakable. The original Promised Land was in Africa. Every key event, every major ancestor, every defining river and mountain, every kingdom and tribe existed in the African Nile and Kush River corridor. The Levantine map is a later invention. Finally, as we come to the end of this video, let's take a look at biblical practices of the true original biblical Israelites to pin down which continent in the whole wide world still has the following practices. Which groups of people in the world give dowry when they are getting married, mourn for the dead with lamentations when someone passes away, and on top of that, practices polygamy and skin scarifications. We will use these practices to detect which continent had the original true location of the Promised Land and chosen people of God, based on these practices and these specific criteria. Let's take a closer look. The Bible describes Israelite life with practices like paying a bride price to a woman's family before one can get married, the practice of loud public crying for the dead, and Israelites having more than one wife. Some of these practices can be found in many cultures worldwide, but never does one see any groups outside of Africa practicing all these aforementioned traditions holistically as we find among African groups. God also warned the Israelites not to cut their bodies like the neighbors who were going to be around them, which means they lived among neighbors who did that. So the real location of God's chosen people must be a place where all these things are practiced. A group that pays bride price, wails for the dead, and allows many wives, and also lives right next to groups that do scarification. Today, the only continent where you can see all of these things together, living side by side as normal parts of life, is Africa. In many African societies, like among the Dinka or Yoruba, bride price, loud mourning, and polygamy are normal, while nearby tribes always practice scarification for beauty and identity. This matches the Bible's picture perfectly. Israel had bride price, Exodus 22 verses 16 to 17, professional mourners, Jeremiah 9 verses 17 to 20, and many wives, Deuteronomy 21 verse 15. But God told them not to cut their skin like the nations around them, Leviticus 19 verse 28. Since Africa is the continent where this exact combination of practices exists together right now, it points to Africa as the original homeland of the biblical Israelites and the true location of the Promised Land based on these cultural markers. So in conclusion, the Bible's original world was African, and slowly, piece by piece, the truth is returning. Thanks for watching. Remember, truth doesn't fear investigation. Keep searching, keep asking, and keep questioning what you've been told. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. See you in the next episode.